I am 71 years old. I worked for 40 years to earn that money. And in just one morning, my son took it all. Not a sneaky theft, not a mistake. It was intentional. It was planned. Then he put me in his car, drove me into the deep woods in the middle of a freezing winter, and left me alone. If you think you know what betrayal feels like, listen to my story to the end. Hit like, leave a comment with the name of the city you're watching. I want to know how far my story has gone. The bank statement was sitting on the kitchen table when I woke up that Thursday morning. I almost didn't look at it. I was 71 years old with a bad knee and a worse hip, and most mornings I moved through my kitchen like a man trying not to wake something up. Slow, deliberate, careful not to jostle the ache that lived in my lower back from 38 years of construction work. I put the coffee on. I stood at the window and watched the snow falling outside, the same heavy gray November snow that had been coming down for 3 days straight. I thought about nothing in particular. That was the luxury of retirement, I used to tell people. You get to think about nothing for the first time in your life. Then I sat down at the table and I saw the envelope. It had my name on it. Harold Whitmore. Printed, not handwritten. Return address, Cascade Valley Credit Union, the institution where I had kept my retirement savings for 11 years. I had a good relationship with that bank. I knew the branch manager, a quiet woman named Patricia, who always remembered that I took my coffee black. I had never received a letter from them that worried me. I opened it without thinking. And then I sat very still for a very long time. Account balance, $0. I read it again. I set it down. I picked it up and read it a third time, the way you do when words stop making sense, when your brain refuses to process what your eyes are showing it. 0. Not a rounding error, not some clerical mistake that would be sorted out with a phone call. $0.00 in an account that had held, as of 3 weeks ago when I last checked, $412,000. The savings of a lifetime. Every dollar I had set aside for my paycheck starting in my early 30s, every bonus I had banked instead of spent, every sacrifice I had made, the vacations I didn't take, the car I drove until the transmission fell apart, rather than financing a new one, the dinners I cooked at home instead of restaurants because I wanted to retire with something real. $412,000. Gone. My hands were shaking when I set the letter down. I noticed that from a distance, like I was watching someone else's hands shake across someone else's kitchen table. There was a roaring sound in my ears, the kind that comes when your blood pressure spikes and your body doesn't know whether to fight or collapse. I sat with that roaring for what felt like a long time. Then I thought of Derek. I don't know why his face was the first thing that came to me. I want to tell you that I dismissed the thought immediately, that a father's instinct pushed it away, that I reached for some other explanation, a banking error, a fraud from outside, identity theft, anything. I want to tell you that. But I'd be lying. His face came to me the way an answer comes to you when you already know the truth and have been avoiding it, quick and certain and impossible to unsee. Derek had been helping me manage my finances for 8 months. It had started last March when I slipped on ice coming down my porch steps and fractured my wrist. Nothing life-threatening, but at my age a broken wrist is more complicated than it sounds. I couldn't drive for 6 weeks. I had trouble with the computer, with paperwork, with all the small administrative tasks that keep a person's life running. Derek had offered to help, and at the time it had felt like grace. "Dad, just let me handle some of this for a while," he'd said, sitting across from me at the same kitchen table. He was 43 then, my only child, and he had his mother's eyes. A deep, clear brown that could look very sincere when he wanted them to. "You don't need the stress right now. Let me take some of this off your plate." I had given him limited access to my accounts, enough to pay the utility bills, handle my insurance paperwork, deal with the pharmacy. That was all I had intended. That was what we agreed on. But I was recovering, and I was tired, and Derek was attentive in a way he hadn't been in years. He called every other day. He brought groceries. He sat with me on the weekends and watched football, and laughed at my bad jokes, and seemed genuinely like the son I remembered from before everything had gotten complicated between us. I let myself relax. I told myself that sometimes it takes a crisis to remind a family what it's for. I understand now that I was being managed, that every phone call, every bag of groceries, Every afternoon on the couch watching football was a performance, a long, careful performance designed to keep me comfortable while he figured out how to take everything I had. But I didn't know that on a March afternoon when my wrist was in a cast and my son was handing me a cup of coffee and telling me not to worry.
Escúchame.
I called the bank at 8:15 in the morning. The woman who answered was polite and professional and clearly trying very hard not to sound alarmed. She pulled up my account. She confirmed the balance. She told me, with the careful phrasing of someone who has had this conversation before, that the funds had been withdrawn via a series of authorized electronic transfers over the course of 6 weeks, the last of which had cleared 4 days ago. Authorized, I said. Yes, sir. The transfers were processed by an account holder with access credentials. All the security protocols were followed. My son had access to this account. There was a pause. I'd recommend you come into the branch as soon as possible, Mr. Whitmore, and you may want to contact the authorities. I hung up the phone and sat there with the morning light coming through the window and the snow still falling outside and this enormous, impossible silence around me. The coffee I'd made was getting cold. I hadn't touched it. I was thinking about Derek, where he was, what he was doing at that moment, whether he was sleeping soundly in his apartment 20 miles away, whether he had already spent some of it, whether he had planned this for a week or a month, or whether this thing had been growing in him for years and I had simply never seen it. Then I heard the sound of a car in my driveway. I knew the sound of his car. A dark blue Jeep he'd bought 2 years ago, with a particular rumble in the engine he kept saying he was going to get fixed. I heard it pull up. I heard the engine cut off. I heard his boots on the porch steps. He knocked twice and then opened the door with his key, which I had given him in April and never asked back. Morning, Dad. He came in with a stamped-down cheerfulness, snow on his shoulders, moving toward the coffee maker like he lived here. Nasty out there. Roads are getting bad. I sat at the table with the bank letter in front of me, and I watched my son pour himself a cup of my coffee, and I said nothing. He turned around. He saw my face. Something moved through his expression. Not guilt, not yet, or maybe not the kind of guilt that looks like guilt, more like a recalibration, a quick, almost invisible adjustment. What's wrong? He said. I picked up the letter and held it out toward him without saying a word. He took it. He looked at it. And then he did something I will never forget for as long as I live. He shook his head slowly with what appeared to be concern and said, Dad, what is this? You tell me. This looks like, this has to be some kind of error. Have you called the bank? I called them at 8:15 this morning, Derek. And what did they say? They said the transfers were authorized. They said someone with access credentials moved the money out over 6 weeks. I paused. 6 weeks, Derek. He set the letter down. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. He put his elbows on the table and pressed his hands together in front of his face, like a man thinking hard, like a man working through a problem. It was a convincing performance. I will give him that. If I had not already called the bank, if I had not already heard the word authorized, I might have believed it. Dad, he said carefully, I think there might have been some kind of fraudulent access to your account. Someone could have gotten your login information. These things happen all the time to older people. Don't, I said. He stopped. Don't do that, I said again. Don't sit in my kitchen and look me in the eye and tell me this is happening to me. Don't insult me like that on top of everything else. His expression shifted, just slightly. The concern faded and something flatter and harder moved in underneath it. I don't know what you think you're accusing me of, he said. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm telling you what the bank told me. The transfers were authorized. You had access to my account. You have been the only person with access to my account for 8 months. I picked up the coffee cup finally, more for something to do with my hands than because I wanted coffee. It was cold and bitter, and I drank it anyway. I want to know where my money is. Derek was quiet for a long moment. The snow was coming down harder outside. Through the window behind him, I could see it accumulating on the hood of his Jeep. You know what, Dad? He said finally. I think you need to get out of this house for a few days. I think the isolation is getting to you. You've been cooped up here all winter. You're stressed, and you're not thinking clearly. Something cold moved through me that had nothing to do with the weather. I'm thinking very clearly, I said. I have a place, he said. He said it like it was a gift he was offering. A cabin up in the mountains. A friend of mine owns it. I borrowed the keys last month. It's quiet. It's beautiful. It's away from everything. Why don't we drive up there today, get you out of your head for a couple of days, and we can sort all of this out when you're calmer? I stared at him. This is the moment I come back to more than any other, because it is the moment where everything that happened next was determined by a single decision I made. I looked at my son across my kitchen table and I heard what he was proposing, and something in me, some deep old thing that had been a father for 43 years, that had taught this man to ride a bicycle and drive a car and shave for the first time, that thing chose, against all available evidence, to believe that maybe he was right. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe a few days away would help us talk through this without it becoming something irreparable. I told myself I was choosing reconciliation. What I was actually choosing was a very different thing entirely. We left at 10 in the morning. I brought a bag because he told me to bring a bag. 3 days, he said, maybe 4. I packed warm clothes, my blood pressure medication, a book I'd been meaning to finish. I locked the front door of my house and walked to his Jeep and got in and buckled my seatbelt. Derek drove north out of town. The interstate, then state routes, then roads I didn't know, smaller and narrower as we went, climbing into the foothills and then into the mountains proper. The snow was falling steadily. The radio played a country station for a while, and then it lost signal and we drove in silence. The kind of silence that has weight to it, that sits between two people and says things that neither of them is willing to say out loud. I tried a few times to talk. Derek, we need to discuss what happened with the account. Not while I'm driving in this weather, Dad. I need to focus. An hour later, I want to understand what you were thinking. Whatever you needed, you could have asked me. I told you, let's talk at the cabin. An hour after that, Derek, how much further is it? Not much further. He was right about that. 15 minutes later, he turned off a gravel road onto what was barely a path, 2 tire tracks through deep snow with pine trees pressed close on both sides, and I felt a shift in the quality of the silence inside the car, something that I would have called, if I were being precise about it, dread. The cabin came into view. It was small and dark, set back from the tree line, with a covered porch and shuttered windows, and the general look of a place that had not been used recently, not a retreat, not a refuge, a forgotten place. The kind of place that doesn't get found easily. Derek stopped the Jeep and turned off the engine. Here we go, he said, in a voice of complete normalcy. We went inside. It was cold, colder than outside, if that was possible, the deep bone cold of a space that has been shut up through weeks of winter without heat. There was a wood stove in the corner and a stack of wood beside it, a cot with a folded blanket, a small kitchen with a propane burner and a cabinet that held, as I would discover later, 3 cans of soup and a box of crackers. No phone, no radio, no computer. I stood in the middle of that small, cold room and turned around slowly, taking it in. Derek, I said. The wood stove is pretty straightforward, he said. He was standing by the door, still in his coat. He had not, I realized, taken off his coat. There's matches on the shelf. Should be enough wood to last a few days. Derek, look at me. He looked at me, and this time his face was not performing anything. There was no concern there, no warmth, no performance of a sun. There was something emptier than that. Resolved, decided. The roads get bad fast up here, he said. You should get that fire going before it gets dark. What are you doing? What I had to do, he said simply, like it was the truest thing he'd ever said, like he had been waiting a long time to be able to say it. Derek, you weren't supposed to notice for another week. Something that might have been annoyance crossed his face. You're sharper than I thought. I'll give you that. The words hit me like a physical thing. You weren't supposed to notice for another week. He had timed this. He had stood in my kitchen 8 months ago and offered to help and already known, somewhere in the back of that calculating mind, how it would end. Derek, don't do this. My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. Whatever you think you're gaining, it's not worth it. We can still fix this. I won't press charges. I just want the money back. Just give it back and we don't have to. I'm not going to prison, Dad. Then give it back. I'm not going to prison, he said again, like he hadn't heard me, and I'm not giving it back. He opened the door. Cold air flooded in. Outside, the snow was falling harder than it had been, the sky closing down toward the mountains like a lid. There's no cell signal up here, he said. Probably a mile and a half to the main road. Don't try to walk it in this weather. Derek, I heard the desperation in my own voice. I hated it. I hated that I was standing in a freezing cabin begging my son not to abandon me in the wilderness, that this was what our 43 years had come to. Please. He looked at me for one more moment, and I want to tell you I saw something in his eyes then. Some crack, some flicker of the child he had been, some last-second hesitation. I want to tell you that because it would make the story more bearable. But the truth is, what I saw in my son's face in that doorway was nothing. A door that had been closed so long the hinges had rusted. He pulled the door shut behind him. I heard his boots on the porch steps. I heard the Jeep start. I heard it reverse down the track, and then the sound of the engine dissolved into the wind and the snow, and there was nothing left. Just the cold and the silence and the smell of a cabin that nobody had been in for weeks, and the sound of my own breathing, which was faster than it should have been, and the distant sound of the wood stove ticking as the last warmth seeped out through the walls. I was alone. I don't know how long I stood there. At some point my body made a decision before my mind did. Some survival instinct older than thought that said move, get warm, do something. And I crossed to the wood stove and opened it and started laying wood inside with hands that were shaking so badly I dropped 2 logs before I got them placed. The matches were on the shelf where Derek had said they'd be, a half-empty box of kitchen matches, and I struck 3 before one caught and held. The fire took slowly. I fed it more wood. I sat on the floor in front of it because there was no chair close enough, and I pressed my hands against the warming iron and tried to make myself think. I was 71 years old. I had a bad knee and a worse hip. I had medication in my bag that I took every morning without fail. Outside there was a blizzard coming down and the temperature was dropping, and Derek had said a mile and a half to the main road, which meant a mile and a half through deep snow in deteriorating conditions with bad joints and inadequate footwear, because I had packed for a weekend cabin stay, not for a survival situation. My son had planned this. He had looked at the calendar and the weather forecast and the state of my health, and he had calculated that I would not survive walking out of here. I understood that with a clarity that went beyond thinking, the way you understand certain things not in your brain but somewhere lower. The fire was catching now. I pulled the folded blanket off the cot and wrapped it around my shoulders and sat in front of the growing warmth and let myself feel, for just a moment, the full weight of what had been done to me. The betrayal of it, the architecture of it, how long it must have taken to build, how many ordinary afternoons had been covering for something monstrous, how many times my son had looked me in the eye and chosen to continue. 43 years. I had loved this man for 43 years. Before he was complicated, before he was difficult, before he became whatever it was he had become. He had been my boy. I had held him in a hospital room the size of a closet, and he had weighed 7 pounds and 6 ounces, and I had been so afraid of breaking something so small that I'd barely breathed. I remembered his first day of school. I remembered teaching him to throw a baseball in the backyard. I remember driving 9 hours to move him into his first apartment and eating bad pizza on boxes because the furniture hadn't arrived yet. And then I stopped remembering, because remembering was going to break something in me that I needed to keep whole if I was going to get out of here alive. I needed to think, not feel. Think. I went through the cabin methodically, starting with the kitchen, the 3 cans of soup, the crackers, mostly full, a jar of peanut butter, about a third remaining, a canteen that I filled from the sink. The pipes still worked, which meant the water hadn't frozen yet, which was something. A flashlight in the drawer beside the stove. 4 batteries, good ones. I shook them, and they didn't rattle. A box of protein bars behind the soup cans that I almost missed. I counted them. 8 bars. I found a wool blanket in the closet, a pair of heavy work gloves, men's large, too big for my hands but better than nothing. A hand crank emergency radio that had no batteries. No axe, no snowshoes, no map, no signal flares. I sat back down in front of the fire with my inventory laid out in front of me, and I tried to calculate. The food, rationed carefully, could last a week, maybe 10 days. The woodpile outside on the porch was substantial. Someone had prepared for a long winter, or at least a long stay. The fire would keep me from freezing. But nobody knew I was here. That was the central fact. My neighbor, a good man named Ron Pruitt, who checked on me occasionally during bad weather, thought I had gone to stay with my son for a few days. I hadn't told anyone else. I had a daughter-in-law, Derek's ex-wife Claire, but we hadn't spoken since their divorce 3 years ago. I had no other family within reach. My friends were the kind of friends you have at 71. Good people, but scattered. People I might go a week without speaking to, without anyone thinking anything of it. Derek had counted on all of that. He knew my life, because I had trusted him with it. I got up and went to the window and looked out through the gap in the shutters. The snow was coming down harder now, thick and horizontal, and the light was already fading even though it was barely past noon. The temperature outside had to be in the single digits and dropping. The path that Derek's Jeep had driven in on was already nearly invisible, the tire tracks filling in fast. I put my forehead against the cold glass and closed my eyes. You aren't going to die here, I told myself. You didn't work 40 years and raise a child and build a life to die in a stranger's cabin because your son wanted your money. I opened my eyes. Figure it out. The first night was the worst. I had the fire going, but the cabin walls were thin and the wind was ferocious, and I burned through more wood than I had intended, trying to keep the temperature bearable. I slept in short stretches on the cot with both blankets wrapped around me, and woke every hour or so to feed more wood into the stove. The darkness complete and total when I opened my eyes, the wind screaming outside, and each time I woke up there was a half second before memory returned, a merciful half second of blankness. And then it all came back. The bank statement, the kitchen table, the cabin, Derek's face in the doorway. I thought about a lot of things in those dark hours. I thought about the warning signs I had missed or refused to see. Derek had always been difficult about money, not as a child, but as an adult, starting sometime in his 30s. There had been a period in his late 30s when I had lent him $18,000 to cover some business losses he never fully explained, and he had paid back about half of it before the repayment stopped, and the subject became awkward and then simply stopped being discussed. I had told myself it was fine. That family wasn't a ledger. Then there had been his divorce from Claire, which had turned ugly in ways that surprised me. Claire was a decent woman, and I never fully understood what had happened between them, only that by the end Derek was saying things about her that seemed designed more to justify his own behavior than to describe anything she had actually done. I had tried to stay neutral. I had told myself it wasn't my business. There had been small things, comments about what the house was worth, what the land might sell for, questions about my retirement savings that were phrased as concern but had an edge underneath them. A conversation 2 years ago where he had said, in a tone meant to sound casual, "You know, Dad, most people your age think about consolidating their assets." I had changed the subject. I had filed it away somewhere I didn't have to look at it. And then last March, when the ice took me down on the porch steps, and I came up with a fractured wrist and a son who was suddenly, attentively, helpfully present, I had let myself be grateful instead of careful. I had wanted so badly to believe that the difficulty between us was circumstantial, that underneath it he was still the boy I had loved, that people could turn back toward each other after years of growing apart. I had been a fool, not a naive fool, a willing one, the kind of fool who knows better and chooses not to know better because the truth is harder to live with. I lay in the dark and listened to the wind and thought about all of it, and somewhere in the middle of the second night I made a decision, not a dramatic one, not the kind of decision that announces itself. A quiet, interior thing, the kind that happens in the part of you that has been through enough to know what it costs to give up and choose, deliberately, not to pay that price. If I survived this, when I survived this, I was going to make sure that Derek faced what he had done. Not for revenge. I want to be clear about that because revenge is a clean word for a messy thing, and what I felt was messier than revenge. I wanted accountability. I wanted the world to know what he had done. I wanted him to stand somewhere, a courtroom, anywhere, and have the thing he had done to me named in front of people who could see it clearly, because there is something that happens to a person when their evil stays hidden. It grows. It repeats. It finds the next person to target. I was not going to be the last old man Derek Whitmore hurt, unless I did something about it. Get out of this cabin first, I told myself, then handle the rest. On the third morning, the storm broke. I woke to silence, the abrupt, almost physical silence that follows heavy weather when the wind drops and the world becomes very still. I got up slowly, every joint complaining, and went to the window. The snow had stopped. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue. The drifts came up to the bottom of the window frame, 3 feet at least, and the world outside was white and sharp and achingly beautiful, in the way that indifferent things can be beautiful. I stood there looking at it for a long moment, then I started making plans. The main road was 1.5 miles away, Derek had said. In normal conditions, 30 minutes on foot for a man my age. In 3 feet of snow with bad joints and work gloves that didn't fit, the calculation was different, significantly different, but staying here was a slower death than attempting it. The wood wouldn't last forever, and nobody was coming. I ate one of the protein bars. I drank water. I took my blood pressure medication and thought, almost with dark humor, about how absurd it was to worry about my blood pressure in this context. Then I dressed in every layer I had, pulled on the work gloves, tied my boots as tightly as my stiff fingers would allow, and opened the cabin door. The cold hit me like a wall. The kind of cold that takes your breath and makes your eyes water immediately and seizes up your joints before you've taken 2 steps. I stepped off the porch into the snow. It came up past my knees. I started walking. I want to tell you about that walk, because it was one of the longest hours of my life, and because I think what happened inside my head during it matters. It wasn't heroic. I wasn't resolute and steady and purposeful the way people are in movies. I was cold and afraid, and my knee was screaming inside the first 15 minutes, and I stopped 3 times because I genuinely did not know if I could continue. Standing there in the middle of a snow-covered track in the mountains with pine trees on both sides, and silence so profound I could hear my own heartbeat. Each time I stopped, I thought about Derek, not with anger or not only with anger, with something more complicated. With grief, maybe, with the knowledge of what it means to love a person for decades and discover that what you loved was a version of them they had outgrown or never actually been or had been performing so long they'd forgotten it themselves. There is no clean feeling for that. There is no word that covers it exactly. But grief, I have learned, is not the same thing as defeat. I kept moving. The main road appeared like a hallucination, a wider break in the trees, the suggestion of pavement under the snow. I reached it and stood at the edge and looked both ways at a road that had not been plowed and showed no tire tracks and felt my heart drop. Then I heard something. A sound, distant and mechanical, coming from the south. I stepped into the middle of the road. The snowplow came around the bend 2 minutes later, an enormous orange machine with its blade scraping along the asphalt, and I stood in its path and waved my arms and thought, with a clarity that surprised me given everything, this is not where it ends. The plow stopped. The driver's window came down and a man looked out at me. 50s, heavy set, wearing a Carhartt beanie and an expression of pure shock. "What in the hell?" he said. "I need help," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "I need to call the police." He stared at me, at my layers of clothing, at the direction I'd come from, at whatever my face looked like at that moment. "How long have you been out here?" he said. 3 days, I said. He had a phone. He handed it down to me without another word. I dialed 911. And standing in the middle of a snow-covered mountain road with cold burning into every part of me, and the plow driver watching from his cab with an expression I can only describe as reverent, I began, in a voice that did not waver once, to tell them everything. Later, when they asked me what had kept me going, the investigators, the hospital staff, eventually the reporters, I never gave them the answer they seemed to want. They wanted resilience, fortitude, the triumph of the human spirit. Maybe that's part of it, but the honest answer is simpler and harder. I stayed alive because I was angry, not a hot, explosive anger, something deeper. The cold anger of a man who has been underestimated by someone who is supposed to love him, and who has decided, with everything that remains in him, that the underestimating will be the other person's fatal mistake. Derek Whitmore thought he knew what his father was made of. He was wrong about that. He had been wrong about that for a very long time. The plow driver's name was Gary Hutchins, and he was the first decent thing that had happened to me in 4 days. He didn't ask a lot of questions. He just climbed down from his cab after I finished the 911 call, took one look at me standing in the road like something the storm had spit out, and said, "Get in the truck. You can tell the story once to the people who need to hear it." I was grateful for that more than I could say. I was running on empty in every sense, physically gutted, emotionally scraped down to the bone, and the idea of having to explain myself twice before I could sit somewhere warm was more than I thought I could manage. Gary gave me a thermos of coffee that tasted like the best thing I had ever put in my mouth, and turned the heat up until I stopped shaking, and we sat there on the side of that mountain road in his orange plow truck, waiting for the sheriff's deputies to arrive. And he didn't say anything, and I didn't say anything, and it was the most humane silence I had experienced in a very long time. The deputies came in 2 vehicles, blue lights cutting through the bright winter morning. A third vehicle behind them turned out to be an ambulance, which I hadn't expected, though in retrospect I shouldn't have been surprised. I was 71 years old, and I had spent 3 days alone in a freezing cabin and then walked a mile and a half through waist-deep snow. I probably looked exactly as bad as that sounds. The paramedics wanted me on the stretcher immediately. I told them I would walk to the ambulance under my own power, which was stubbornness more than necessity, but it mattered to me in a way I couldn't articulate right then. I had walked out of that mountain on my own legs. I wasn't going to be carried out of it. I gave a preliminary statement to a deputy named Carver while the paramedics took my vitals and wrapped me in thermal blankets. He was young, mid-30s maybe, with a careful, professional face and a notepad that he held with both hands. I told him the basic shape of it: my son, the bank account, the cabin, the 3 days alone. I watched his expression change as I talked, something tightening behind his eyes. The particular look of a person hearing something they recognize as serious and trying to maintain professional composure while processing what it actually means. "Mr. Whitmore," he said when I finished, "I want to make sure I have this right. Your son drove you to this location, left you there without means of communication or transportation, and you have reason to believe he has taken funds from your financial accounts." $412,000, I said, "from my retirement account at Cascade Valley Credit Union." He had access credentials. The bank confirmed the transfers were authorized. Carver wrote that down. "And you have no other explanation for how those funds were moved?" "None. Derek had access. No one else did." He nodded slowly. "Okay. We're going to need a full statement, recorded at the station once you've been medically cleared, and we'll need to contact the credit union." He paused. "Do you know your son's current whereabouts?" "His apartment is in Hargrove, 20 miles south of my house." I gave him the address. I knew it by heart. I had driven there plenty of times, helped him move in, brought him soup when he had the flu 2 winters ago. "I don't know if he's still there." "We'll check on that," Carver said, and something in the way he said it told me that checking on that was going to become someone's immediate priority. The ambulance took me to Ridgeline Regional Medical Center, 40 minutes down the mountain. I had moderate hypothermia, which sounds alarming, but in practical terms meant my core temperature was lower than it should be, and I needed to be warmed slowly and monitored for a few hours. My blood pressure was elevated. My knee, which had been making its displeasure known since approximately the first 50 steps of that morning's walk, had some inflammation that the emergency physician described as consistent with overexertion. He said this with the diplomatic neutrality of someone who had decided not to ask the obvious follow-up question. "You're in pretty good shape for what you've been through," he told me. He was a compact, efficient man named Dr. Reeves, who moved through the examination room like someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that his patients would often not follow his advice. "I want to keep you overnight for observation. Your core temp is stabilizing, but I don't want to rush it. I need to make some phone calls first, after we get you settled." "Now," I said, with respect. He looked at me for a moment and then handed me his own cell phone without another word. The first call I made was to my attorney, a woman named Sandra Chu who had handled my estate planning for 12 years. I got her voicemail and left a message that I knew would alarm her. Sandra, it's Harold Whitmore. I need you to call me as soon as you get this. My son has stolen my retirement savings and left me to die on a mountain. I'm at Ridgeline Regional. Please call. The second call was harder. Claire answered on the third ring, Derek's ex-wife, the woman I hadn't spoken to in 3 years because I had been trying, unsuccessfully, to remain neutral in a divorce that hadn't been neutral at all. Harold? Her voice was careful, surprised. Is everything okay? No, I said. It's not. I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to the whole thing before you say anything. She listened. She didn't interrupt once, which is harder than it sounds when what you're hearing is what I was telling her. When I finished, there was a silence, and then she said very quietly, He's been planning this for a long time. You know something about it? Not about this, not specifically. She took a breath. But I know things. Things I probably should have told you during the divorce and didn't because I didn't want to. I don't know. I didn't want to put you in the middle of it. I thought you'd think I was just angry. Another pause. Harold, Derek has a gambling problem. A serious one. Has had it for at least 5 years. That was a big part of why we... She stopped. He owes money to people. The kind of people you don't want to owe money to. I lay in the hospital bed with thermal blankets over me and the IV in my arm, and this new information settling over everything like a layer of sediment, changing the shape of things underneath it. It made a horrible kind of sense, the urgency of it, the calculation. A man in debt doesn't just steal from his father out of greed. He steals because he is desperate, because the alternative is something worse than getting caught, and desperation makes people capable of things that ordinary greed doesn't. It didn't make what he'd done less monstrous, but it explained the timeline, the thoroughness of it. He hadn't had the luxury of patience. He had needed the money, and he had needed it quickly, and I had been the most accessible source. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. I tried not to make it sound like an accusation, but I don't know if I succeeded. I'm sorry, Harold. Her voice was raw in a way that told me she meant it. I'm genuinely sorry. I told myself it wasn't my place. That he was your son and you knew him better than I did. A short, humorless breath. I was wrong about that last part. We were both wrong about that, I said. After I hung up, I lay there for a long time with the afternoon light coming through the hospital blinds and the sounds of the medical floor coming through the door, and I tried to arrange what I now knew into something I could use. The gambling debts explained the theft, but they also complicated it. If Derek owed money to dangerous people, he would have moved fast after taking the funds. He might have transferred the money in ways that were harder to trace than a straightforward bank withdrawal. He might already be trying to leave the area. It was possible the money was already gone in ways that would make recovery complicated. That thought scared me in a different way than the cabin had. Sandra called back at 4 in the afternoon. I had been moved to a regular room by then, warmer, with a window that looked out over a parking lot and a patch of snow-covered mountains in the distance. I told her everything I had told Deputy Carver, and then I told her what Claire had said about the gambling debts. Sandra was quiet for a moment, in the particular way she got quiet when she was thinking fast. I had seen it in person enough times to recognize it over the phone. Harold, she said finally, how much does Derek know about your full financial situation? He had access to the retirement account, that's all. He doesn't know about the Millhaven property? The trust holdings? No, I said. I never discussed those with him. Another silence. Okay, she said. That's important. That changes things significantly. I could hear her writing. The retirement account is the visible money. The trust assets are protected differently. If he doesn't know they exist, he can't have touched them. What Sandra was talking about required some explanation, and this is perhaps the moment to give it, because it matters to everything that came after. 12 years ago, when Sandra had helped me with my estate planning, we had set up a family trust to hold certain assets. A piece of land I owned in Millhaven County, about 80 acres of undeveloped property that had belonged to my grandfather, along with some modest investment holdings that I had been accumulating separately from my retirement account for years. The trust was not connected to the accounts Derek had accessed. It wasn't something that showed up on the credit union statements. It wasn't something I had ever mentioned to Derek directly, partly because the planning conversation with Sandra had happened during a period when Derek and I were barely speaking, and partly because I had simply never found the right moment to bring it up. In other words, Derek had stolen what he could see. He had no idea what he couldn't see. "We need to make sure those assets are fully locked down," Sandra said. "I'll file an emergency protective motion tomorrow morning first thing. And Harold, I want you to work closely with whoever the investigators assign to this case. The financial trail is going to be critical. Bank records, transfer logs, any communications Derek sent you during the 8 months he had access. If any of that exists in writing, preserve everything." "I have emails," I said. "Texts." He was careful, but not careful enough about using text messages to coordinate the account access. "Save every single one." I could hear the focus in her voice, that particular Sandra sharpness that I had always found reassuring. "This is a winnable case, Harold. What he did is documented. What he did to you physically, leaving you in those conditions. That's potentially criminal exposure beyond the financial theft. We're talking elder financial abuse, theft, reckless endangerment, possibly more depending on how the DA wants to frame it." "Sandra," I paused, "how bad does this get for him?" Another silence, different from the thinking one. "Bad," she said simply. "If the DA pursues it fully, and given the circumstances I expect they will, we're talking years, Harold, not months." I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I was supposed to feel at that. I felt something quieter and sadder. I said, "Okay," and thanked her, and we agreed she would be at the station when I gave my full recorded statement the following morning. The night nurse who came in to check my vitals at 9 o'clock found me sitting up in the hospital bed with the lights on, wide awake. "You should try to sleep," she said. Her name was Donna, according to her badge, a middle-aged woman with a matter-of-fact kindness that I found easier to receive than sympathy. "I know," I said. "I'm working on it." She did something with the IV line and made a note on her tablet and then paused at the door. "For what it's worth," she said, "I overheard a little of what you told the deputy this afternoon. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. These rooms don't have great sound insulation. It's fine." "You walked out of those mountains by yourself," she said, "at 71, in those conditions." She shook her head. "I've seen a lot of people come through here. I don't say this to a lot of them. But you've got something tough in you, Mr. Whitmore." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said, "Thank you, Donna." She nodded and pulled the door most of the way closed, leaving a strip of corridor light, and I lay back and listened to the sounds of the hospital settling into its nighttime rhythms. I thought about Derek. Where was he right now? What was he doing? Did he know yet that I had walked out, that I had called the police, that the clock he thought he'd set was running faster than he'd planned? Or was he still in his apartment, or somewhere else, believing himself safe? Believing his father was dead or dying in a mountain cabin and that he had successfully converted 40 years of my labor into a solution to problems I hadn't known he had? I tried to locate pity somewhere in what I felt and couldn't find much of it. That bothered me slightly. I have never wanted to be the kind of man who loses the capacity for pity entirely. But there is a threshold past which pity becomes something you have to manufacture rather than feel, and leaving your father to die in a blizzard is past that threshold. What I felt instead was a kind of iron patience, the feeling of a man who has survived the worst thing and come out the other side and now knows, with a certainty that requires no maintenance, that what happens next is simply a matter of letting the truth do its work. The truth had already been doing its work for a while, it turned out. Deputy Carver called the hospital at 7 the following morning, 20 minutes before my recorded statement was scheduled. His voice was careful in a new way when I answered. "Mr. Whitmore, I wanted to let you know before you came in that we located your son yesterday evening." I sat up. "Where?" "His apartment. He was home." A pause that told me there was more. "Mr. Whitmore, we also found evidence in his apartment relevant to the investigation. I can't go into detail over the phone, but I want you to know that things are moving. We're working with the Financial Crimes Unit and the Credit Union." "Was he arrested?" "He was taken in for questioning. As of this morning, formal charges are pending. Your attorney will have more specific information when she gets here. I sat with the phone in my hand after he hung up, looking at the strip of winter sky visible through the window. Gray and cold and still, the mountains somewhere behind it, invisible from here. Derek had been home. He hadn't run. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe the gambling debts had their own geography, their own restrictions on where a person could go. Maybe he had simply not believed that his father would walk out of those mountains. Maybe he had believed it so completely that it hadn't even occurred to him to run. That last possibility was the one that stayed with me. Because that was the thing about Derek's calculation, about the entire careful architecture of what he had done. It was built on an assessment of who I was. A man of a certain age, a certain physical condition, alone in a cabin in a blizzard. His math had said, he won't make it. His math had been wrong. And I thought, sitting in that hospital bed with the morning light beginning to come through the window, about how many decisions had been made about me over the past year that were built on the same faulty foundation. The assumption that age is the same thing as diminishment, that a man of 71 with a bad knee and a worse hip and an overdue conversation with his cardiologist has already been reduced to something manageable, that he can be handled, arranged, moved from here to there, and ultimately discarded. The people who make that assumption about older people are almost always wrong, and the tragedy is not that they get corrected. The correction is a kind of justice. The tragedy is that the correction comes at such a cost. Sandra arrived at 8:30, looking composed and prepared in the way she always was, her briefcase over one shoulder, a thermos of what I knew from experience was exceptionally strong coffee in her other hand. She took one look at me in the hospital bed and said, "You need to eat something before we do this." "I've been eating. Something real. Not whatever they've been bringing you in here." She set down her briefcase and produced, from what seemed like a coat pocket, but was probably her bag, a wrapped breakfast sandwich from the diner 2 blocks from her office, where we had been having meetings for 12 years. She placed it on the tray in front of me and sat down in the chair beside the bed with the ease of someone who had been in enough hospital rooms to have lost the awkwardness most people feel in them. "How are you, Harold? Really?" It was not exactly a question the way she said it. It was more like an invitation. "I'm angry," I said. "I keep thinking I should feel other things, and then I feel angry again instead." "That's appropriate," she said. "What he did is enraging. You're allowed to be enraged." "I keep thinking about missed signals." I unwrapped the sandwich. Egg, cheese, something I couldn't identify and didn't need to. Things I saw and didn't act on. "That's also normal and also not useful right now," Sandra said. "Right now I need you sharp for this statement. The details matter. Every date you can remember, every communication, every instance where he discussed the accounts with you. We're building a timeline, and the timeline needs to be airtight." She opened her briefcase and set a legal pad on her knee. "After that, we talk about the trust assets and what protective steps we've already taken." "You filed the motion?" "First thing this morning. The Millhaven property and the investment holdings are fully locked. Nobody is touching those without a court order, and getting a court order right now, given the circumstances, would be effectively impossible for Derek or anyone acting on his behalf." She looked at me over the top of her glasses. "He didn't know about the trust?" "No." Something moved across her expression. Not quite satisfaction. Sandra was too disciplined for expressions of satisfaction at this stage, but something adjacent to it. "Good," she said. "That's very good, Harold." I ate the sandwich. It was better than anything I had eaten in 5 days, which was not a high bar but felt significant anyway. Outside the hospital window, the morning was brightening, the gray lifting, the mountains becoming visible again on the horizon, distant and white and indifferent, the way mountains are. I had walked out of those mountains. I hadn't planned to feel anything particular about that, but sitting there in the warmth with Sandra across from me and the food in my hands and the faint sound of the hospital going about its morning, I felt it anyway. Not triumph. Something more worn than that. Something that the word survival doesn't quite cover, because survival is about the body, and what I was feeling was about the rest of it. I was still here. I was still here, and I was about to walk into a room with a recorder and a detective and tell my story for the official record, and somewhere across town, in a police station he had never expected to see the inside of, Derek Whitmore was beginning to understand what it meant to have miscalculated. "Are you ready?" Sandra asked. I set down the wrapper from the sandwich and straightened up as best I could in the hospital bed and looked at her. "Yes," I said. "Let's go." The recorded statement took 3 hours. I sat in a room at the Ridgeline County Sheriff's Department with Sandra on my left and a detective named Paulson across the table, a lean, methodical man in his 50s who asked questions the way a carpenter measures twice, carefully, without hurry, going back over the same ground from different angles until he was satisfied he had the shape of it right. There was a recorder on the table between us and a second detective by the door, whose job seemed to be writing things down and occasionally leaving the room to check something, then returning with a quiet nod or a folded piece of paper that he slid across to Paulson without comment. I told it all from the beginning. March. The fractured wrist. Derek's offer to help. The account access I had granted him. I walked Paulson through 8 months of what I now understood had been a deliberate, patient dismantling. The way Derek had made himself indispensable before he made himself wealthy. The way he had kept me comfortable and slightly distracted while he moved money in increments small enough not to trigger automatic alerts. The way he had timed the final withdrawal and my removal to coincide with a forecasted storm system that would have made any search and rescue attempt unlikely for at least 72 hours. That last part, the storm timing, was what made Paulson set down his pen and look at me directly for the first time in a while. "He checked the weather forecast," I said. "He knew that storm was coming. He drove me up there the morning it was due to arrive." "You're certain of the timing?" "The storm started that afternoon. We left my house at 10 in the morning." I paused. "He told me the roads were getting bad when he knocked on my door. They weren't, not yet. He was moving me before they got bad, not because they were bad." Paulson picked his pen back up and made a note. Something had shifted in his expression. Not shock. He was too experienced for shock, but a sharpening, the look of a detective who has just had something confirmed that he already suspected. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "I want to go back to the financial transfers. You said the withdrawals happened over 6 weeks in increments. Do you know the approximate size of those increments?" "The bank told me the transfers ranged from $12,000 to $40,000 each, kept under the reporting threshold when possible, I assume." "That's called structuring," Sandra said quietly beside me. "It's a separate federal offense." Paulson nodded. He already knew that. "And during those 6 weeks, Derek was in regular contact with you. He called twice a week, came to the house on weekends, usually Saturday. Did anything about his behavior seem different during that period?" I thought about it. Genuinely tried to think, not just confirm what they seemed to be looking for. "He seemed easier," I said finally. "More relaxed than he'd been in a while. I thought it was because we were getting along better. Because he was helping and it was going well." I stopped. I thought it was because things were improving between us. I was wrong about what was causing it. The relief of a man who has already secured what he came for, I understood now. The loosening that happens when the hard part is done and you're just running out the clock. The second detective came back into the room at that point and slid a piece of paper to Paulson, who read it without changing expression, which I was beginning to understand was simply how his face worked. He folded the paper and set it aside and continued with his questions as though nothing had happened, but 10 minutes later he paused the recording and stepped out of the room with his colleague, leaving Sandra and me alone. "What was on that paper?" I asked her. "I don't know, but they found something." She had her legal pad on the table and had been making her own notes throughout, parallel to the official record. "Harold, I want you prepared for the possibility that the money trail is complicated. If he was paying gambling debts, some of those funds may have moved through informal channels that are harder to trace and harder to recover." "How much harder?" She met my eyes. Sandra was not a woman who softened things unnecessarily, which was one of the reasons I had worked with her for 12 years. "Some of it may be gone in ways that are practically irrecoverable. I'm not saying that to discourage you. The criminal case is strong regardless, but I don't want you building your expectations around 100% recovery." I nodded. I had thought about this in the hospital, running numbers in my head in the dark. "If the retirement account is a total loss," I said, "what does that leave me?" "The trust is intact," The Millhaven property alone, at current valuations, is worth considerably more than what Derek took. The investment holdings add another layer on top of that. She paused. You're not going to be destitute, Harold. That's what I'm telling you. He took a significant amount of money. He didn't take everything. He didn't know about everything. No, Sandra said. He didn't. And there it was again. That fact, sitting quietly in the room with us. The fact that Derek had built his entire plan around an incomplete picture. He had been thorough about what he knew and completely blind to what he didn't. And the thing about that kind of blindness is that it feels like confidence right up until the moment it doesn't. Paulson came back in and restarted the recording, and we continued for another 40 minutes. By the time we finished, I was exhausted in the deep way that comes not from physical effort, but from sustained emotional concentration. The effort of holding the shape of something terrible in your mind and rendering it accurately for strangers. Sandra walked me back to the hospital to collect my discharge papers, and on the way she said carefully, Paulson told me something before we left. What? They found a burner phone in Derek's apartment, prepaid, purchased 6 weeks ago. There are text messages on it. She kept her eyes forward as she walked. He was communicating with someone during this period, about the money, about you. They're still going through everything, but Paulson said, and this is preliminary. It looks like he was not acting entirely alone. I stopped walking. What does that mean? It means someone may have known what he was planning, possibly helped facilitate it. She turned to look at me. Does the name Marcus Teal mean anything to you? The name hit me somewhere I didn't expect. Not because I knew Marcus Teal well, but because I knew the name, had heard it once, maybe 18 months ago, in a context I had barely registered at the time. Derek had mentioned him in passing during one of our Saturday visits. A friend, he'd said. Someone he was doing some business with. I had not asked follow-up questions because at that point, Derek mentioned a rotating cast of vague associates, and I had long since stopped trying to track them. I've heard the name, I said. Derek called him a business associate once. I didn't think much of it. Teal has a record, Sandra said. Financial fraud. An elder exploitation case in another county 3 years ago that resulted in a plea deal. Paulson says the pattern of the transfers, the structuring, the timing, matches Teal's previous cases fairly closely. I started walking again, slowly, processing this. So Derek didn't invent this. It's possible he had help inventing it, or that Teal saw an opportunity and helped shape the plan. The implications of that settled over me as we walked the last block to the hospital. Because what it meant, if it was true, was that this had not simply been a son's betrayal of his father. It had been something more organized than that. Derek might have been the instrument, but he might not have been the only architect. Someone had looked at a 71-year-old man with a retirement account and a son with gambling debts and a broken wrist and seen a business opportunity. That made it worse somehow, in a way I wasn't entirely prepared for. The betrayal of a son is devastating, but it has a human shape to it, a comprehensible shape built from whatever went wrong over whatever years it went wrong in. The idea of a stranger looking at my life and seeing a target, that was a different kind of violation. Colder. More impersonal. The kind that makes you feel not just hurt, but used. I collected my discharge paperwork, and Sandra drove me home. My house looked different when we pulled into the driveway. I am not sure how to explain that, except to say that 3 days in a mountain cabin with the possibility of dying in it changes the way ordinary things look when you return to them. The porch steps where I had slipped in March. The front door. The kitchen window I had stood at Thursday morning, watching snow fall while my coffee brewed, not yet knowing what the envelope on the table contained. These things looked both exactly the same and completely unfamiliar, the way things do when you've seen them from a distance you didn't choose. Sandra came inside with me and made sure the heat was on and the refrigerator had something in it. She had stopped at a grocery on the way, without asking, just put things in a bag and paid for them, which I found unexpectedly moving. She checked the locks. She called a contact of hers, a private security firm, and arranged for someone to do a walkthrough of the property the following morning, which I had not asked for and would not have thought to arrange myself. I don't think Derek is a physical threat to you at this point, she said, gathering her coat to leave. He's smart enough to know that anything directed at you now would bury him, but I want the bases covered. Sandra, I said her name and then wasn't sure what I wanted to follow it with. She waited. "Thank you," I said finally, "for moving fast, for the motion this morning, for all of it." She put on her coat with a practical efficiency and picked up her briefcase. "You've been a client for 12 years, and you've never been anything but straightforward with me," she said. "This is what the relationship is for." She paused at the door. "Lock this behind me." I locked it behind her. The house was quiet, in the way houses are quiet when you've been away from them. A lived-in silence that feels more present than actual silence. All the small familiar sounds of a space that knows you. The refrigerator hum. The tick of the baseboard heaters warming up. The particular creak of the floorboard in the hallway that had been creaking since I moved in 18 years ago and that I had always meant to fix and never had. I sat at the kitchen table, the same chair, the same window with the same view of the backyard, and I put my hands flat on the surface and breathed. 4 days ago, I had sat here and read a bank statement that said 0. The world had shifted enormously in 4 days. And yet, here I was, at the same table, still here. My phone, which the hospital had returned to me along with my other belongings, the phone that had no signal in the mountains and had therefore been useless when I needed it most, began to ring. A number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me. "Harold Whitmore?" A man's voice, businesslike. "Speaking. My name is Agent David Riley. I'm with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Division. I've been briefed on your case by Detective Paulson, and I'd like to schedule a time to meet with you in the next day or two." A pause. "Mr. Whitmore, I want you to know that what you've reported has flagged activity that we've been looking at through a different lens for several months. Your son's associate, Marcus Teal, is of significant interest to our unit." I sat forward in the chair. "He's done this before." "I can't discuss specifics of an ongoing investigation, but I can tell you that your cooperation is going to be valuable, and that we take these cases very seriously." Another pause. "How are you holding up, sir?" It was a human question, tucked into the bureaucratic frame of the conversation, and it caught me slightly off guard. "Better than I was 4 days ago," I said honestly. "I imagine so." Something in his voice, not quite warmth, but the suggestion of it. "Get some rest. I'll call tomorrow to schedule." After he hung up, I sat there for a long moment with the phone in my hand. Marcus Teal. Ongoing investigation. Federal level. The thing Derek had set in motion by being impatient enough to need my money quickly, by being desperate enough to act before he had truly calculated the cost, had apparently put him in proximity to something that was already under examination by people with considerably more resources than Detective Paulson. Derek had not just stolen from his father, he had stumbled into a federal case. I thought about calling someone to tell them this. My neighbor Ron, maybe, a friend. But it was evening now, and I was exhausted down to the cellular level, and the truth was there was no one I wanted to talk to right now except possibly myself, which is not as strange as it sounds. There are moments when the only company you can manage is your own. I went through the house slowly, turning on lights as I went, reacquainting myself with each room. The living room with its bookshelves and the armchair by the window where I read in the evenings. The hallway with its creaking board. The bedroom that looked exactly as I had left it Thursday morning. The bed made, the curtains open, my library book on the nightstand with the bookmark still in it at page 211. I stopped in the doorway of what I had always called the study, though calling it a study was generous. It was a small room lined with file cabinets and a desk, and the accumulated paperwork of decades, the organized record of a life managed carefully. On the desk, there was a manila folder I had put there 3 weeks ago, containing the most recent statement from the family trust, which I had been meaning to review and had not gotten to. I went in and sat at the desk and opened the folder. The trust assets, as of the last valuation, were worth just over $900,000. The Millhaven land alone accounted for most of that, the 80 acres that had been in my family for 3 generations, and that had become considerably more valuable in recent years as development pushed outward from the nearest town. Sandra had told me this. I had known this in an abstract way. Sitting with the folder open in front of me now, after 4 days in a freezing cabin and 2 days in a hospital and a morning giving testimony about what my son had done to me. Sitting with it now, the number had weight it hadn't had before. Derek had taken $412,000. He had left $900,000 sitting in a trust he didn't know existed, in assets he had never thought to ask about, because he had decided he already understood the shape of his father's finances. He had been wrong about that, the way he had been wrong about what his father was capable of surviving. I closed the folder. Outside the study window, the night was clear and cold, the first clear night since before the storm. Stars were visible, which they rarely are in town, but the cold had swept the sky clean, and there they were, precise and indifferent and numerous. I looked at them for a while through the window. I was not the same man who had sat at the kitchen table Thursday morning and read a bank statement. Something had happened to me in those mountains that was not only about survival. Something had been stripped away in the cold. Not my strength, I want to be clear about that, but a certain softness in how I looked at things. A willingness to leave things unexamined because examining them was uncomfortable. I had carried that willingness for years, and the mountains had taken it, and I found, sitting in my study at the end of an extraordinarily difficult week, that I did not want it back, because that softness had cost me. Not just the money, that was recoverable. What it had cost me were years of clarity I had chosen not to have, years of seeing things and looking away, years of telling myself that the warning signs were something else, that my son was difficult but not dangerous, that the distance between us was circumstantial, that the next conversation would be the one where things got better. I had been lying to myself. Not viciously, not with bad intent, the ordinary lying that people do when the truth is harder to carry than the lie. I was done with that. The phone rang again. This time I recognized the number. Claire, Derek's ex-wife. "I hope it's not too late to call," she said. "It's fine. I'm up." "How are you?" She asked it the way Agent Riley had, humanly, directly, without the usual softening. I was starting to understand that she and I were going to need to have a different kind of relationship going forward than the carefully neutral non-relationship we had maintained since her divorce. "I'm still processing," I said honestly. "Did you hear anything today?" "I heard he was picked up for questioning. A friend of mine in the county clerk's office told me." A pause. "Harold, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago." "What is it?" "Last year. Around February." She stopped, gathered herself. "Derek called me. We weren't exactly on speaking terms, but he called anyway. He said he was in trouble with money, and he wanted to know. He asked me whether I knew if you had assets outside of your regular accounts, like land or trust holdings." Her voice was careful. "I told him I didn't know anything about your finances, which was true. But the reason I'm telling you now is because I realized that call was him figuring out how much I knew before he moved forward with whatever he was planning." The air in the room felt slightly different after she said that. February. He had been gathering intelligence in February, checking what Claire knew, mapping the edges of his plan's risk. The timeline shifted backward further than I had known. "He asked you about trust holdings specifically," I said. "He said property or investments outside of normal accounts." Those were his words. I thought it was strange, but I figured he was maybe trying to make sure I hadn't gotten anything in the divorce settlement that you were holding for him. She paused. "I know how that sounds." "It sounds like you didn't have any reason to think what you're now thinking," I said. "Don't do that to yourself." A long silence on the line, then, "I'm sorry I didn't call you in February, Harold. I'm sorry I didn't say something." "I know," I said. "I believe you." I said goodnight to Claire and sat for another hour in the study with the folder in front of me and the stars visible through the window and the house quiet around me, in that particular way it gets quiet when you're the only one in it. I thought about February, about Derek making that phone call, already planning, already running the math. About Sandra filing the trust protection that morning. About Agent Riley and Marcus Teal and an investigation that had been quietly gathering evidence for months before I stumbled into it through the worst week of my life. All those moving parts, none of which Derek had known about. All those walls he hadn't known he was walking toward. I went to bed at 11 and I slept. Not well, not deeply, but I slept. And when I woke at 5 in the morning to the gray pre-dawn light coming through the curtains, my first thought was not about Derek. My first thought was about the Millhaven property, the 80 acres that had been my grandfather's, the land that had stayed in the family through 3 generations of men who had worked for it and protected it and handed it forward. Derek had tried to erase me. He had looked at his father and seen an ending, something to be converted into cash and spent on debts and a running start. What he had failed to understand, what he had never been able to understand, because understanding it would have required him to see me as something more than a resource, was that I was not done. Not by a considerable distance. Agent Riley came to the house 2 days later. He was younger than his phone voice had suggested, early 40s, with the kind of unremarkable face that you forget and then remember again when he says something that lodges itself in your thinking. He came alone, which surprised me, and he accepted the coffee I offered and sat at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around the mug in the way of someone who has had too many meetings in too many cold offices and has learned to appreciate warmth wherever it appears. He started by telling me what he could tell me, which was less than I wanted and more than I expected. Marcus Teal had been on the financial crimes enforcement radar for 2 years. He operated what appeared on the surface to be a financial consulting business, legitimate enough to have letterhead and a website and a handful of actual clients who provided cover. But the real business was something else. He identified vulnerable targets, older people, primarily, with accessible assets and family situations that could be exploited. He found individuals who had something to gain from the exploitation and coached them, sometimes recruited them, always insulated himself carefully behind a layer of separation from the actual crime. He took a cut. He covered his tracks. He moved on. 3 previous cases we can connect to him, Riley said. 2 resulted in plea deals that kept him out of a prison sentence. The 3rd didn't have enough to charge him at all. He set down his coffee mug. Your case is different. How? Because of the burner phone and because of what's on it. He leaned forward slightly. Mr. Whitmore, in the text exchanges between your son and Teal, Teal is explicit about the plan. More explicit than he's been before. He got careless or comfortable or both. There are messages where he outlines the strategy, the account access, the structuring of the withdrawals, the timing with the storm. A pause. And there are messages where he discusses you specifically. Something cold moved through me that had nothing to do with the weather. What do the messages say about me? Riley was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of a man deciding how much to give. He refers to you as the problem, he said finally, in the context of what to do if you survived the cabin. The words sat between us on the kitchen table. He was planning for the possibility that I'd walk out, I said. There are messages suggesting contingency plans, yes. Nothing that rose to the level of a specific threat. Teal is careful enough for that. But the implication is clear and a prosecutor is going to be able to make something of it. He held my eyes. Which means this is no longer simply a financial fraud case or even an elder abandonment case. The federal exposure here is substantial. I sat with that, the idea that my survival had been a variable someone had accounted for, that there had been a contingency conversation about what to do with Harold Whitmore if Harold Whitmore didn't have the decency to die in the mountains the way he was supposed to. Something about it moved through my anger and came out the other side as something harder and colder that I didn't have an exact name for. What do you need from me? I asked. Your financial record's going back 18 months. Any communications between you and Derek, texts, emails, voicemails if you have them. And I'd like to go through the timeline of the account access with you in detail to match it against the burner phone messages. He picked up his coffee again. We're building a case against Teal as much as against your son. Your cooperation is valuable for both. You'll have everything I have, I said. Whatever it takes. He stayed for 2 hours. We went through dates and messages and account access records with a precision that was exhausting and necessary. When he finally left, he shook my hand at the door and said, with the directness that I had come to appreciate about him, I want to be straight with you. These cases take time. You're not going to see resolution in weeks, probably months, possibly longer depending on how the legal process moves. I know that's hard to hear. I've waited for things before, I said. He nodded. I believe that, he said, and left. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that looked like ordinary life from the outside, but felt, from the inside, like waiting for a verdict that hadn't been rendered yet. Sandra called with updates every few days. The protective motion on the trust assets had been formalized. The Millhaven property was fully secured. The credit union had frozen the accounts under investigation. There were civil proceedings beginning alongside the criminal case, which Sandra explained with the patience of someone who has explained complex legal processes many times and has made peace with the fact that they are inherently unsatisfying to people who want resolution to look like something clear and fast. I went back to my life, or tried to. I cooked. I read. I had Ron Pruitt over for dinner one Tuesday evening and told him the whole story, which took most of the evening and 2 pots of coffee, and Ron listened with the focused attention of a good man hearing something that genuinely disturbs him and not trying to minimize it. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a moment, and then said, Harold, I have to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Go ahead. Are you okay? Not practically. I mean inside. He made a gesture that was somehow both awkward and precise. Because what you went through, that's not something you just walk away from. I thought about it. Honestly, the way he'd asked, I'm not okay the way I was before, I said. I don't think I will be in exactly that way. But I'm not broken. I'm different. I looked for the right word. I'm clearer. Ron nodded slowly. That might be the most Harold Whitmore answer I've ever heard. I laughed at that. It was the first real laugh I had managed since before the bank statement, and it felt strange and then felt right, the way things do when your body reminds you that it still knows how to do certain things even when your mind has been somewhere else. The formal charges came down 6 weeks after my statement. Sandra called me on a Wednesday morning with the specifics. Derek had been charged with elder financial abuse, theft over $50,000, criminal abandonment, and reckless endangerment. The DA, a woman named Vasquez, who Sandra described as thorough and unsentimental, had added a charge of premeditated fraud based on evidence of the timeline. The fact that Derek had begun structuring the withdrawals before I had even fractured my wrist, which meant the injury and the subsequent offer to help had not been the origin of the plan, but rather the opportunity to execute one that was already in progress. That last part hit me harder than I expected. He had been planning it before March, before the ice, before the fractured wrist, before the gracious offer to help, and the groceries and the Saturday afternoons watching football. All of that had been an execution of a plan that already existed. He had looked at me and seen a target, and then he had waited for the right opening, and when the ice gave him one, he had walked through it. The premeditation charge is significant, Sandra said. It changes the sentencing exposure substantially. How substantially? Vasquez is pushing for 10 to 15 on the theft and fraud charges alone. The abandonment and endangerment add more. She's also coordinating with Agent Riley on the federal side. There's going to be a parallel federal proceeding related to the structuring and the connection to Teal. 10 to 15 years. I sat with that number. Tried to feel something clean and decisive about it, the way you're supposed to feel when you hear that justice is going to be served in quantifiable increments. What I felt instead was more complicated. Grief still, underneath everything else. Not for the man Derek had become. I had grieved that man through 3 nights in a freezing cabin, and I was done with that particular grief. Something smaller, for the version of events that had never been possible and that I had spent too long pretending might still happen. The version where things got better between us, where the distance of the last 10 years turned out to be circumstantial rather than fundamental. That version had never been real. I understood that now with a clarity I hadn't had before. But understanding it and being finished with the grief of it were 2 different things, and I wasn't going to pretend they were the same. What about Teal? I asked. Federal charges are coming. Riley called me yesterday. They're ready to move. Wire fraud, conspiracy, a pattern of racketeering that covers all 3 previous cases in addition to yours. A pause. He made a mistake with the burner phone, Harold. People like Teal operate for years on the basis of being careful, and 1 lapse is all it takes. This is going to unwind his entire operation. I thought about the other people Teal had targeted, the previous cases that had resolved in plea deals, the case that hadn't resulted in charges at all, other Harold Whitmores, other people who had been assessed as resources by someone who looked at older people and saw vulnerabilities rather than human beings, people who may not have had a Sandra Chu or an Agent Riley or a family trust that Derek didn't know about, people for whom the math had worked out differently. I was glad that Teal's lapse had happened on my case, not just for myself. 2 months into the legal proceedings, I did something that surprised even me. I called Derek. I want to explain why, because the obvious question is why on earth I would call my son, who had stolen my retirement savings and left me to die in a blizzard, and the answer is not simple. I had been talking to a counselor, a practical, direct woman named Dr. Marsh, who had been recommended by Dr. Reeves at the hospital, and who had none of the soft edges I had expected and didn't need. And she had said something in one of our sessions that had stayed with me. She said, "Sometimes people need to say the thing they need to say, not because it will change anything for the other person, but because carrying it unsaid is its own kind of damage." I was not calling Derek to reconcile. I was not calling him to give him the opportunity to explain or apologize. I was calling him to say something that I had been carrying and that I was done carrying. His attorney had told him not to speak to me, which was the correct legal advice, and which Derek followed. The call went to voicemail. I left a message. "Derek, it's your father. I don't expect you to call back, and I'm not asking you to. I have one thing to say, and then you'll never hear from me again unless it's in a courtroom." I paused. I spent 40 years building something, not just the money. I mean something, a way of living that had integrity to it. Work and honesty and taking care of what was mine and not taking what wasn't. I wasn't a perfect man, and I wasn't always a perfect father, and I know there are things between us that are my fault too. I'm not pretending otherwise. Another pause. But what you did to me is not something I caused. You chose it. You planned it. You left me in that cabin knowing I might die there, and you did it for money, not because I wronged you, because you wanted what I had, and you decided the easiest way to get it was to erase me. My voice was steady. I had not planned what I was going to say, but it came clearly. I walked out of those mountains. I'm still here. And I want you to know that not because I'm gloating. I don't feel like gloating. I'm telling you because I think you built your whole plan on the idea that I was already finished, that I was old enough and alone enough that I didn't matter anymore. And I need you to know, for your own reckoning, whatever that turns out to be, that you were wrong about that. I mattered. I still matter. And you will spend a very long time paying for having forgotten it. I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a while after that. The house was quiet. Outside the window, the yard was brown and dormant, the last of the winter being slowly replaced by the first tentative signs of something else. Snowdrops pushing up along the fence line where they came back every year without being asked to. Dr. Marsh asked me at our next session how I felt after making the call. "Like I set something down," I said. "Good," she said. "What did you set down?" "The part where I'm still trying to make him understand." I looked at my hands on the armrests of the chair. I think I spent a lot of years trying to explain myself to Derek in ways he was never going to hear, adjusting how I said things, adjusting what I asked for, adjusting my expectations, trying to find the right approach that would finally land. I paused. That voicemail was the last time. After that, I stopped trying to reach him and started thinking about what I actually wanted my life to look like. Dr. Marsh made a note. "That's a significant shift," she said. "It took a mountain," I said. She almost smiled. "Most significant shifts do." The civil proceedings, running parallel to the criminal case, began producing results that Sandra had promised, and I had tried not to count on before they arrived. The credit union had managed to freeze a portion of the transferred funds before they were fully dispersed, $160,000 of the $412, recovered through the cooperation of 2 financial institutions that had flagged unusual activity. The rest had gone where Claire had predicted: gambling debts, wire transfers to accounts associated with Marcus Teal's operation, a portion that the forensic accountants described with the clinical neutrality of their profession as having been dissipated in ways that are unlikely to support recovery. $160,000. Not everything, less than half. Sandra told me the news in her office, across the same desk where we had structured the family trust 12 years ago, and I listened and did the math in my head and then sat with it. That's the realistic recovery from the retirement account, she said. The civil judgment against Derek will be for the full amount. The difference becomes a debt he carries, which affects him going forward even if the cash isn't recoverable right now. She set down her pen. Harold, you know what I'm about to say. The trust assets, I said. The trust assets are intact. The Millhaven property valuation has actually increased since we filed the protection order. There's been development interest in that corridor. She opened a folder on her desk. Combined with the investment holdings and the recovered funds, your net position is, you're going to be fine, more than fine. She said it plainly, without performance. He didn't take everything. He took what he could see, and you were careful in ways he didn't know about. I looked at the folder without opening it. I had been careful in ways he didn't know about. I had spent 12 years building protections I had thought of as estate planning, and that had turned out to be something more immediate. Sandra had proposed the trust structure on the basis of tax efficiency and generational transfer, and I had agreed to it for the same mundane reasons. Neither of us had known at the time that we were building a wall between me and a threat I hadn't imagined yet. Sometimes the sensible thing turns out to be the life-saving thing, and you don't know it until you need it. The criminal trial date was set for late spring. In the months between, I watched the case build from a distance. The way you watch something large and slow-moving that has your name on it but is no longer in your hands. Sandra updated me. Riley updated me. I gave a deposition in January that took 4 hours and left me drained in a particular way that had nothing to do with the physical effort. Sitting across a conference table from Derek's defense attorney, a competent man named Brill, who was doing the job he was paid to do, answering questions about my son with careful precision, not because I wanted to, but because the truth was the only thing I had that was worth giving. Brill tried several times, with professional subtlety, to suggest that my account of events might have been affected by the hypothermia, by stress, by the particular fog that can settle over a person's memory during a traumatic experience. I answered him with the same patience I had used to get through those 3 days in the cabin. I had not been foggy. I had been cold and afraid and utterly alone. But my mind had been working with the brutal clarity that fear sometimes produces, cataloging everything, holding every detail against the possibility that I would need it later. I had needed it later, and I had it. The day Brill asked me in a tone of deliberate casualness whether I was certain Derek had known about the approaching storm before we left, whether it was possible he had simply been trying to help his distressed father by taking him somewhere quiet, I leaned forward slightly in my chair and looked at him with a steadiness that I did not have to manufacture. My son told me the roads were getting bad when he arrived at my house at 8:30 in the morning, I said. They weren't bad at 8:30. They got bad that afternoon. He said the roads were bad to create urgency, to make me feel like we needed to leave quickly before I had time to think about it clearly. I paused. The storm forecast was public. It had been in the news for 2 days. Anyone who wanted to know it was coming had the information available to them. Another pause. My son wanted me out of that house and into that cabin before I had a chance to make a phone call or contact my attorney or do anything else that might have complicated his plan. The weather gave him a reason that sounded like concern. It wasn't concern. Brill moved on to his next question. I drove home from that deposition through streets that were just beginning to show the first suggestion of spring, the bare trees not yet leafed out, but something in the air that wasn't winter anymore, and I thought about the version of myself from 2 years ago, from 5 years ago, who would have found this day unimaginable, who had watched Derek become someone harder and more distant, and had told himself it was just difficulty, just the friction of adult relationships, nothing that couldn't eventually be smoothed out with time and the right conversation. That man had been wrong, but he had also, in the practical sense, done one thing right. He had built a trust structure that his son didn't know about, and that trust structure was why Harold Whitmore at 71 was still standing. Sandra called that evening while I was making dinner. A simple thing, pasta and a salad, the kind of meal you make when you want the comfort of your own kitchen without the effort of performing anything. Brill reached out today, she said, after the deposition. He wants to discuss a plea arrangement. I turned down the burner on the stove. What kind of arrangement? Derek pleads guilty to the theft and fraud charges, serves a reduced sentence. Brill is floating 6 to 8 years. The reckless endangerment and abandonment charges get absorbed into sentencing rather than tried separately. And what does he give us in return? Full cooperation with the federal case against Teal. Everything he knows, everything he has, documented communications, agreements, the full scope of his involvement. Sandra paused. Vasquez isn't thrilled. She wanted to try this. But Riley wants Teal, and Derek's cooperation is the cleanest path to Teal. 6 to 8 years instead of 10 to 15. I stood in my kitchen with the pasta going and thought about what I was being asked to weigh, and I found that what I felt was not what I might have expected, not a burning need for the maximum sentence. Something more exhausted than that, something that understood the difference between justice and punishment without being entirely comfortable with either one. What do you recommend? I asked Sandra. I think you let the prosecutors decide, she said. This is Vasquez and Riley's call to make. Your input matters, but this is their case now, Harold. You've given them everything they need to make it. A pause. What I think you need to focus on is not Derek's sentence. It's what comes next for you. What comes next for me? I had not thought about that as clearly as I probably should have. I had been so concentrated on the case, on the legal proceedings, on the daily work of rebuilding what had been disrupted, that I had not spent much time in the forward direction. What did comes next look like for a 71-year-old man who had just survived the worst year of his life and come out the other side with his assets mostly intact and his illusions permanently altered? I've been thinking about the Millhaven land, I said. What about it? I've had development interests, like you said, but I've also been looking at, there are lakeside communities, retirement communities, on the eastern edge of the county. Nice ones. Active, not waiting rooms. I paused. I've been thinking about selling a portion of the land. Not all of it, a portion, and using it to move somewhere that's less quiet than this house. Sandra was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, there was something in her voice that was not quite warmth, but was adjacent to it. That sounds like exactly the right thing to think about, she said. I hung up and finished making dinner and ate it at the kitchen table. The same table, always the same table, and looked out at the yard where the snowdrops had given way to something else now, early crocuses pushing up along the fence in the particular purple that always surprised me no matter how many springs I had seen it. The house was the same house. I was not entirely the same man, and somewhere across the city, in a conversation with an attorney about what kind of deal to take for the years that stretched out in front of him now, much reduced, my son was beginning to understand the distance between what he had imagined and what had actually happened. He had imagined an ending. What he had gotten instead was an accounting. Derek took the plea. Sandra called me on a Tuesday morning in late April, and I was standing in the backyard when the phone rang, looking at the fence line where the crocuses had come and gone, and something else was coming up now. I never remembered what came after the crocuses. I always had to wait and see. And she told me in the straightforward way, she told me everything that Derek had signed the agreement the previous afternoon. 6 years, 8 months. Cooperation with the federal case against Marcus Teal in full. Restitution ordered for the full $412,000, which Sandra was careful to clarify meant the obligation existed legally, even though the practical recovery remained what it had been. $160,000 from the frozen accounts. The rest, a judgment that would follow him out of prison and into whatever came after. I stood in the backyard and listened to her lay out the terms and felt the strange flatness that follows a long wait for something you've been told to prepare for. Not disappointment, the outcome was what it was, and Sandra had explained weeks ago that the plea was likely and reasonable given what Riley needed for the Teal case. Not relief exactly. Something thinner than either. The feeling of a door closing on a room you had been trying for a long time not to have to enter. Are you okay? Sandra asked, which she asked more than she used to. Yes, I said. And then, honestly, I don't know what I expected to feel. You expected to feel more, she said. That's normal. It takes time to catch up to itself. She was right about that. It took several days. The sentencing hearing was in May. I did not have to attend, and Sandra advised me that I didn't need to, that my deposition and the evidence on the record were sufficient, and that sitting in a courtroom watching your son be sentenced is not an experience that produces the closure people expect it to produce. I had nodded at that advice and then attended anyway, because there are things you need to witness with your own eyes, regardless of what the wisdom is. You need to be present for the thing so that your memory of it is real rather than assembled from other people's accounts. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. That's the thing about real legal proceedings. They happen in rooms that have the mundane quality of any institutional space, with fluorescent lighting and wooden benches that are not comfortable, and a general atmosphere of people doing a difficult job under difficult constraints. There was no drama in the room. There was paperwork and procedure, and a judge named Holt who was precise and economical in the way of someone who has presided over many sentencings and has long since stopped performing anything for anyone's benefit. Derek stood when it was time to stand. He wore a suit I didn't recognize, dark gray, well-fitted, the kind of thing you wear when you need to make an impression and you are out of better options. His attorney Brill was beside him. I sat in the gallery, second row, with Sandra on my left and an empty seat on my right that I had not intended to leave empty, but that nobody had taken. I looked at my son. He had lost weight since I had last seen him, which had been the morning he left me in the cabin. His face was thinner. There were lines there that were new, or that I was noticing for the first time, the kind of lines that come from sustained stress rather than age. He looked, to my eyes, like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and had only recently understood that it was not going to get lighter. He did not look at me. Not once during the entire proceeding, not when he entered the room, not when the charges were read, not when Brill spoke on his behalf in the measured, careful language of a defense attorney doing his job. I had told myself I didn't need him to look at me, and mostly that was true. But I noticed it anyway, the way you notice an absence. Judge Holt asked Derek if he had anything to say before sentencing. Derek stood. He had a prepared statement. I could see the paper in his hands, slightly creased from being folded and unfolded. He read from it in a voice that was steady at the beginning and less steady by the end. He said he was sorry for what he had done. He said he understood the gravity of it. He said he had made choices he could not undo and that he intended to spend the time he had been given. The phrase he used was "time I've been given," which landed wrong in a way I couldn't immediately articulate, as though the sentence were a gift rather than a consequence, thinking about the harm he had caused. He did not say my name, not once in the statement. I don't know if that was strategic or personal or simply the result of not being able to get it out. I sat with it during the drive home and the evening after, and I came to no conclusion. Some things don't have conclusions. They just have the facts of them, and you carry the facts. Holt sentenced him to 6 years and 8 months as agreed, with mandatory participation in a financial restitution program and a prohibition on any financial power of attorney or account access for any elderly individual for the remainder of his life after release. That last condition was something I had asked Sandra to request, and when Holt read it, I felt for the first time that day something that was close to satisfaction, not for Derek's sake, but for the sake of whoever came next. Because a man like Derek, absent significant change, would look for another target when he got out. That condition was a wall between him and the next Harold Whitmore. It wasn't a perfect wall. Nothing is. But it was something. Marcus Teal was indicted on federal charges 3 weeks after Derek's sentencing. I heard about it from Agent Riley, who called on a Friday afternoon with a brevity that told me he was in the middle of other things, but had wanted me to hear it from him directly. Wire fraud, conspiracy, racketeering across 4 jurisdictions. The evidence from Derek's cooperation, combined with what Riley's unit had been building independently for 2 years, had produced a case that Riley described, with professional understatement, as solid. Will it hold? I asked. Teal's attorney is good, Riley said, but the burner phone messages are what they are, and we have 2 other cooperating witnesses from previous cases. I feel good about it. A pause. Mr. Whitmore, I want you to know something. Your case, so the way you documented everything, the way you gave us your statement, the clarity of your testimony at the deposition, it made a difference to how strong this case is. You were a good witness to your own situation. I thanked him. After I hung up, I sat with that phrase for a while. A good witness to your own situation. There is a particular skill in that, which most people don't think of as a skill until they need it. Paying attention to what is actually happening rather than what you wish were happening. Holding on to the precise details, even when the emotional weight of the situation is pressing you toward the general, toward the protective vagueness that makes hard things easier to survive. I had been a good witness to my own situation. I had walked out of the mountain, and I had held on to every detail, and I had given the truth to people who could use it. That was what I had to contribute, and I had contributed it fully. The sale of the Millhaven land, 30 acres of the 80, the southern portion that was most interesting to the developers who had been circling it, closed in June. The number was significant. More than I had expected because Sandra had negotiated with a patience and precision that I had watched with genuine admiration, and because the development interest in that corridor had been even stronger than the earlier valuations had suggested. I will not state the exact amount because numbers have a way of becoming the story when they shouldn't be. What I will say is that after the transaction closed and Sandra walked me through the final accounting, the recovered retirement funds, the sale proceeds, the investment holdings, the remaining 50 acres of the Millhaven property that I was keeping, I understood, in a way that felt almost surreal given where I had started 8 months ago, that I was not a man who had been destroyed. I was a man who had been tested, severely, by someone I loved and trusted. And the test had revealed, among other things, that the foundations were sturdier than either of us had known. The community I moved into in August was called Lakeview Commons, which I had initially dismissed as a name too pleasant to be trusted, the way things named after their best feature sometimes aren't what they advertise. I was wrong about that. It sat on the eastern edge of a lake about 40 minutes from my old house, a community of maybe 200 residents ranging in age from their early 60s to their late 80s, with a level of activity and noise and social friction that reminded me, unexpectedly, of being younger. People had opinions there, loud ones sometimes. There were arguments at the community board meetings about the landscaping and the guest parking policy and whether the Thursday night dinners should include a vegetarian option. I found these arguments deeply comforting in a way that I did not immediately understand and then did. Because arguments about ordinary things are the sound of people who are still invested in their lives, who have not concluded that the daily texture of living is beneath their attention. I moved in with 2 carloads of things I had decided mattered, and a donation truck full of things I had decided didn't, and I stood in my new apartment on the 2nd floor with a view of the lake and the far shore going orange in the early evening, and felt something that was not happiness exactly. It was too complicated and too recent for something as straightforward as happiness, but was its neighbor, a sense of being correctly placed, of being where I was supposed to be, even if the route to getting here had been the last route I would have chosen. My neighbor across the hall was a woman named Evelyn Park, 74, a retired biology teacher with a direct manner and an herb garden on her balcony that spilled over into the railing in a way the community board had apparently opinions about. She knocked on my door 2 days after I moved in with a covered dish and introduced herself with the economy of someone who has reached an age where extended social preambles seem wasteful. "You're new," she said. "I am." "I'm Evelyn. I made too much soup. Do you eat soup?" "I do." "Good." She handed me the dish and looked past me into the apartment with an evaluating eye. "You have a lot of books." "I do." "Me too. The board president thinks we should use those shelves in the common room for decorative objects." She said decorative objects with a precision that communicated exactly what she thought of that position. "I've been fighting it for 2 years." "What's the score?" She almost smiled. "Currently a draw. Do you play chess?" That was the beginning of a friendship that I did not plan and that turned out to be one of the better surprises of the year, which had not been short on surprises. Evelyn was sharp and funny and had no patience for self-pity, which suited me, and she had her own history. A difficult marriage, a son who had moved to another country and called on birthdays and holidays and not much in between, a decade of learning how to build a life that belonged to her and not to the people who had assumed it belonged to them. We played chess on Tuesday evenings, and disagreed about books, and occasionally sat on her balcony watching the lake in a silence that required no maintenance. I told her the whole story one evening in September. Not because I had planned to. I wasn't sure I was ready to tell the whole thing to someone who wasn't Sandra or Riley or Dr. Marsh, but because she asked a direct question, and I found, to my own mild surprise, that I wanted to answer it directly. She had asked why I had sold my house, rather than stayed in it, so I told her. She listened the way she did everything, completely, without interpolating her own reactions into the space of what I was saying. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking out at the lake, which was going dark at the edges, the last light sitting in the middle of the water. "Your son," she said finally, "made the oldest mistake there is." "What's that?" He looked at someone he thought he knew and decided he already understood them completely. People do it to older people constantly. They see the age and they stop seeing the person. She picked up her coffee cup. It's a form of contempt dressed up as practicality, and it almost always costs the person who does it more than they expected. I sat with that. "He's going to be in his 50s when he gets out," I said. "I've thought about that, what that looks like for him." And I don't know what I feel about it. I was honest about that. I don't feel sorry for him, I don't think, but I don't feel the satisfaction I thought I would feel either. It's more like I feel the absence of something, the version of a relationship that I spent too long hoping was possible. "Grief," Evelyn said simply. "Yes. That doesn't go away, it changes." She set her cup down. "But it changes." She was right about that too. The federal trial of Marcus Teal began in October and concluded after 3 weeks of testimony that I followed in news reports and through periodic updates from Riley, with a conviction on 11 of the 14 counts. Teal's attorney had been good, as Riley had predicted. 2 of the racketeering counts were reduced, and 1 charge was dismissed on a technicality. But the core of the case held. Sentencing was scheduled for December. Riley called me with the verdict on the afternoon it came in. "How do you feel?" I asked him. He was quiet for a moment. A rare thing. Riley was not usually a man who paused. "Honestly? Relieved. These cases, when they work, when we actually get a conviction on someone like Teal, it matters. Not just for your case. For the cases he would have run if we hadn't stopped him." A pause. "There were 6 other potential targets we identified in his communications. 6 other people he was positioning. We were able to reach all of them in time." 6 other people. I sat with that. 6 other lives that had continued because Derek's burner phone had been sloppy and I had walked out of a mountain and told the truth to anyone who would record it. "Thank you for telling me that," I said. "Thank you for being a good witness," he said. And we said goodbye for the last time. I sat on the balcony that evening with the lake going dark and thought about all of it. The whole year, laid out in the way you lay things out when they are finally, actually, behind you rather than ahead. I am not a man who usually does that kind of accounting. I have always been more oriented toward the practical next thing than toward reflection. But Dr. Marsh had been working on that with me, the practice of looking back in order to understand what you're carrying forward, and I had been trying. What I found when I looked honestly was this. I had spent a significant portion of the past decade accommodating a version of Derek that I had wanted to be true, adjusting, softening, looking away from the signals because the truth they were pointing toward was something I did not want to arrive at. I had told myself it was generosity or patience or the long-term perspective that parenthood teaches you. But there is a point where those things become a kind of cowardice, and I had been past that point for longer than I wanted to admit. Every time I had loaned money and not talked about it. Every time I had changed the subject when he asked questions that should have alarmed me. Every time I had chosen the comfortable story over the true one. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. Not to assign myself blame for what Derek chose. He chose it. Every step of it. No one made those decisions for him. But the version of me that existed before last November was a man who had decided that keeping the peace was more important than seeing clearly, and that decision had costs. Not just the obvious costs, the quieter ones. The years of half relationships maintained on the basis of what you were both pretending rather than what was real. I would rather have fewer years of something real than many years of something managed. That is one of the things the mountain taught me, if a mountain can be said to teach anything. Not in a grand, transformative way. I am suspicious of transformations that announce themselves loudly, in a small, daily way. The practice of seeing what is actually in front of you and responding to that rather than to what you wish were there. In December, Teal was sentenced to 9 years. I read it in a news report on my phone while sitting in the common room at Lakeview Commons, where Evelyn and I had won the argument about the bookshelves, which now held books, and where a man named Frank Delgado, 77, a retired civil engineer who had moved in 2 months after me and immediately joined every committee available, was across the room complaining to someone about the guest parking situation with a passion I found, for reasons I cannot entirely explain, deeply heartening. I put down the phone. Frank noticed from across the room. He had the attention of a man who has spent a career solving problems and cannot stop noticing when something has shifted in a room. "Everything okay?" he called. "Yes," I said. "It's good news, actually." "Good news deserves coffee," he said, already moving toward the machine. "I'll make a fresh pot." I didn't argue. That evening, I sat on the balcony with a cup of coffee and the lake going silver in the early winter light, and I thought about the Millhaven land, the 50 acres I had kept, the ones that had been my grandfather's, and that I was not selling. I had been talking to a land conservancy about a long-term stewardship agreement that would protect the property from development while keeping it in the family trust, which at this point had no clear heir, but that was a problem I was not in a hurry to solve in any particular way. The land had survived 3 generations of my family. It would survive me. What happened to it after me was something I could think about carefully, on my own schedule, without anyone else's urgency applied to it. That was the other thing I had learned or relearned or learned for the first time in a way that had actually lodged. My life, my assets, my decisions about what to do with the time I had left, these were mine. Not in an aggressive or defensive way, in the simplest possible way. They were mine because I had earned them and built them and protected them, and the person who had tried to make that claim invalid had discovered at considerable cost to himself that it was not invalid at all. I had not stopped being a father. I want to be clear about that, because I think people sometimes assume that surviving something like this requires you to become a different kind of person than you were before, harder, more closed, less capable of the particular vulnerability that love requires. I did not become that person. I don't think hardness was the lesson. The lesson was something more precise, that love without boundaries is not a virtue. It is an invitation to be exploited by people who have learned to mistake your openness for weakness. I had loved Derek. I still loved him, in the durable, weathered way you love someone who has caused you enormous harm and whom you have decided, not easily, you are done trying to save. That is a real kind of love. It doesn't look like the love people talk about in easier contexts, but it is real. And it coexists without contradiction with the absolute clarity that he will not be a part of my life again. Some doors, once they close, are better left closed. Not from bitterness, from honesty, from the willingness to see a situation as it is rather than as you need it to be. The sun was going down over the lake, doing the thing it does in winter when the light is low, and the water catches it in a way that looks almost deliberate, that golden horizontal light that falls across the surface and makes everything visible and everything still. I sat with my coffee going cold in my hands and looked at it for a long time. I was 71 years old. My retirement account had been emptied and partially recovered. My son was in prison. I lived in an apartment rather than the house I had owned for 18 years, had a neighbor who argued about bookshelves and beat me at chess 2 times out of 3, and had discovered at an age when most people assume the significant things have already happened that I was still capable of being surprised by what I was capable of. That is the thing I most want to say to anyone who is listening to this story from wherever you are watching it. Not that betrayal doesn't break you. It does. Not that family is always safe. It isn't. Not that age is a protection against being targeted, because it is often precisely the opposite. What I want to say is something harder and more important than any of those things. You're not finished until you decide you are. No one else gets to make that decision. Not your children, not the people who look at your age and see a diminishing return, not the ones who calculate that you won't survive the winter and make plans accordingly. The decision is yours. It has always been yours. And the moment you allow someone else to make it, the moment you let someone else's assessment of your remaining value become the story you live inside, that is the moment you actually lose something. I almost let Derek make that decision for me. Not consciously, not dramatically. In the quiet, accumulated way of a man who had been looking away from hard truths for a long time and had gotten very good at it. But the mountain interrupted that. The cold and the dark and the absolute necessity of the next step, one foot in front of the other through 3 feet of snow with bad joints and inadequate gloves, and the absolute refusal to lie down. That interrupted it in a way that could not be undone. I walked out, and then I stayed. Those are the two things, if I am reducing it to something a person can carry. Walk out, whatever your mountain is, and then stay. Stay in your own life. Protect what is yours, not because things matter more than people, but because the things you build represent the time you spent building them, and that time was yours, and it deserves to be defended. Build the walls others tell you are unnecessary. Know your own worth well enough that when someone tries to tell you what you're worth, you have a number ready that isn't theirs. And understand this, because it took me 71 years and one very bad winter to understand it fully. The people who try to diminish you are not diminishing you. They are revealing themselves. Every calculation Derek made about my capacity to survive, every assumption Teal made about older people and their vulnerabilities, every choice to see a human being as a resource, those calculations said nothing true about me and everything true about them. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. I finished my coffee. The lake had gone dark except for the far shore where the lights of the houses were beginning to come on, one by one in the early winter evening, warm and ordinary in the way that ordinary things become precious when you have spent time in a place where there were none of them. I went inside. I made dinner. Something simple. I ate it at the table by the window where I could see the water. Then I called Evelyn to confirm chess on Tuesday and called Sandra to discuss the conservancy agreement, and then I sat in the chair by the window with a book I had been meaning to finish for 2 months, and I read it, for no other reason than that I wanted to. Outside, the lake was dark and cold, and the stars were beginning to appear above the far shore, the same stars that had been visible that first clear night after the storm when I had stood at the study window of my old house and understood that I was still here. I was still here. That had been enough then. It was still enough now. And everything between that moment and this one, the investigation, the testimony, the courtroom, the sale, the move, Evelyn and the bookshelves and Frank and his parking grievances and the evenings on the balcony and the slowly changing shape of a life that had been disrupted and was now, imperfectly and irrevocably, and on my own terms, being rebuilt. All of it was mine. He had tried to take it. He had failed. And that, in the end, was the only story that mattered.